So, Isaiah chapter 3. See now, the Lord Almighty, is about to take from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support. All supplies of food and all supplies of water. The hero and warrior, the judge and prophet, the soothsayer and elder, the captain of 50, and man of rank, the counselor, skilled craftsman, and clever enchanter. I will make boys their officials, mere children will govern them. People will oppress each other, man against man, neighbor against neighbor. The young will rise up against the old, the base against the honorable. A man will seize one of his brothers at his father's home and say, "You have a cloak, you be our leader. Take charge of this heap of ruins." But in that day he'll cry out, "I have no remedy, I have no food or clothing in my house. Do not make me the leader of the people." That's probably a kind of a thematic breaking point in the chapter. We'll kind of just stop with that part right there. So last time we had, because this chapter is again heavy on the topic of judgment, and we talked a little bit about the fact that when God is bringing his judgments against people, they can come in two fashions. They can come as matters of pure punishment, and that's just his justice. And then they also come as a matter of his chastisement, or discipline. And that always has the goal of improving his people. For our criminal justice system, although, so you may know that the idea of a penitentiary, that idea was started by the Quakers. But before that, if you did something bad in late medieval times or into colonial times in this country, you see pictures of people in the stocks or what have you. There was a lot more physical pain that was imposed even on adults as a part of the penal code for having broken a law. And it was pretty much just justice. Yeah, maybe they hoped that they might get you to change in some way, but when the penitentiary was established, they're gonna lock you up in a cell, and they're gonna have you sit there for a long time, and the idea is that you'll sit and you'll ponder the evil ways, and that you will come to penitence, right? And thus a penitentiary. It was a place to try to get people to be repentant. At least that was the original idea. Now I think as modern justice is usually carried out, they have programs in prisons and such that want to go that direction, but there's a large degree to which it's also just, you did the crime, now you do the time. That's just how it goes. But when God speaks of his people in the Bible, both the Old Testament Jewish people and in the New Testament those who are members of the church, it also talks about difficult things that come from God's hands that come upon them. At the last book of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, you've got the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Only one of those 7 letters to the 7 churches is purely complimentary. Almost all of them are being confronted about something. Most of them are a mix. Well, I like this about you, but I have this against you, Jesus says. And then he goes on to the problems that they had in those 7 churches in Western Turkey back in the 1st century. But the things that come from God's hands when it comes to his own people tend to be then disciplinary. They're chastisements, but they want to help the people get over their sin. They want to help them grow as parents do with children. I suppose there are parents who simply impose justice on their kids. They're just mad and they're just taking it out. That happens. But for the most part, we understand parenting to be not just an opportunity to impose pain on somebody else, but it is trying to grow them. And we pointed out last time that in the word discipline is the root disciple. You are trying to help that person become a better disciple when we discipline. So as we read these harsh words from the book of Isaiah, and I think was it chapter 28, somebody looked it up for me, where the Lord himself talks about this being his alien or strange work, that his proper work is the gospel. His proper work is bringing grace and forgiveness and showing love and providing his providence. That's his proper work. But he can't only do that because he's got this incorrigible people so often, and so he also has to do this corrective work and his preaching of the law. That is his strange and alien work. It's It's the part of the job he's got to do, even though he doesn't like it so much. But it has a good goal. So when we read these judgment sections in Isaiah, keep that in mind. Now, later on, we're going to rush through them somewhat, but we've got the judgments against the various nations that take almost a dozen chapters towards the end of the middle. And some of that is just God saying, all right, I've had it, we're done with you. We're not trying to correct you because you were never on my side in the first place. But you can't do these kinds of things you're doing with impunity. You have to face consequences. Not so here in chapter 3, as much as some of this is not going to look pleasant. I think it already came up in the conversation last week that as you go through this chapter, it is not hard to see contemporary application, and the more things change, the more they stay the same. So, yeah, you heard what I just read about the governance of the people, all the things that God was going to take away, and that's what we'll pick up first. But to the general question, so we looked at this idea of discipline and punishment. Question 2, the content of chapter 3 is much like the last half of chapter 2. The major difference, we touched upon this even in that previous conversation, but in chapter 2, while there was also a lot of judgment there, in chapter 2, it was more general. God's great day of judgment is coming, and it was more directed at the whole world, at mankind. Whereas this chapter is specifically Judah and Jerusalem. Maybe just good for us to remember there too. We've kind of been talking through this here. But God's message of law first needs to be delivered to his own people. And again, while it's not the thing we ought to dwell on the most, it needs to be there for his own people. There is a tendency sometimes for the church, for Christians, for preachers, to preach about all the sins of society. And it's not that we should ignore those. God's people need to know about that. But they're not here to hear it. And so sometimes people have wondered, well, Pastor, how come you don't bring this up so much in your sermons when you're making applications, law applications? And there are some things, it's not that I'm trying to avoid certain topics, but it doesn't apply so much to the people in front of me at the moment. I try to go for the things, so I do this. On the one hand, I try not to call anybody out specifically. Okay, if it ever feels that way, that is probably happenstance. It just so happened that you did something this week. Maybe we even talked about it, that happened to be in the text. I had a gentleman in my previous congregation who was struggling with a little bit too much drinking. And then, I counseled with him and worked with him for a long time. And there was one of these passages in the epistles where the Apostle Paul lists out the various sins that are going to keep you out of heaven, and that you're not going to have drunkards in heaven, and well, there it is. And I didn't even make it the gist of the sermon. I just commented on it as I went through, and he was sure that I was after him. Well, that's more his guilty conscience than it was any plan on my part, right? Nobody else would have known I ever had that conversation even with him. But if I need to work with the individual sheep in my pasture, that's going to happen in that room back there, or maybe at your house. I'm not going to do that work here, right? It's not good pastoring to try to do that. At any rate, Isaiah's calling the whole nation out here. But just to be aware, the law has to go out to the people here. But your pastor probably is not necessarily picking on everything that's going wrong in society, or so much emphasizing that, unless he sees a problem. Right? I'll mention it, but the sins of God's people, not always, but tend to be a little more subtle. Often they're more the things that are going on in the heart, They maybe have to do with the interrelationships in the congregation, in the church. Those kinds of things probably come up a little bit more for law preaching from the pulpit. Not that I'm afraid to talk about the sins of society. And you need to know about those because we don't want to let people kind of be lulled to sleep about them either and think, well, it must be okay because he never mentions it.
Well, I never thought of, I mean, I've had instances, more than one, several, where I thought, oh, how do you know I needed to hear that today, or whatever, but I never thought it was the pastor doing it towards me. I thought it was God convicting me,
Good.
Oh, good. Good. That's more how it should be, right? And understand, when I'm studying the sermon in my study, I'm applying it to myself first. Just about any application I'm drawing out has run through my head and heart on the way to my mouth to preach it to you. Old pastor friend of mine, Cleve Brumble, he's retired now. His wife would tell him sometimes, I listen to your sermons and I get a pretty good indication about what sins are troubling you by the way you're preaching. And Cleve said, yeah, you're probably right about that, right? C.S. Lewis writes about that someplace. They're at one and the same time both the easiest and the hardest to talk about. They're the hardest because it's me and I don't want to talk about it. They're the easiest because it's me and I get it, right? At one and the same time. Okay, so the difference is it's very specific. It's gone from the general society, the general population of the world, mankind, to Judah and Jerusalem, those who were God's people, those who knew his word, those to whom he had sent his prophets. The question number 3. One commentator has noted that most of the judgments of chapter 3 deal with the removal of Judah's daily bread. How would you categorize the things that Judah will lose in God's judgment, and in what way are they daily bread? So, I don't know how close you were listening when I just read those first 8 verses. What do those first 8 verses seem to be dealing with? Take a peek at your text again there. What kind of things was God pulling out?
Well, it starts out talking about their supply and support.
Okay. So he mentioned supply and support. And then if you think of your daily supply, what kind of things do you usually tend to think of? Food. Okay. Plenty of donuts today. Nobody goes hungry here. Clothing. Shelter. Are any of those in those early verses?
Yes.
What's he talk about pulling away?
Like leadership.
Leadership. All of these kinds of people who were necessary to make society run. And you remember, in fact, if you took Lutheran confirmation as a kid and you had to memorize the catechism, maybe the hardest section of all is Luther's explanation for the 4th petition, give us this day our daily bread. When he says daily bread includes all that we need for our body and life, including, and then you have this list of about 25 things that you're supposed to memorize in order. And some of them are the things that we've mentioned. But then he adds things like good weather, good government, faithful leaders, good neighbors. And I don't know that those are the kinds of things that we often think about with our daily bread. But that too, maybe not to the same degree as food, clothing, shelter, but that too often becomes necessary for being able to live and conduct our lives here. And so a big part of the support of the people was their leadership. And a country that has bad leadership for too long will come to know just the difference that can make on all the other things. Right? It can affect whether there's food. It can affect whether a person can afford to shelter themselves. It can affect whether people are clothed. And, as bad as we think the leadership sometimes has gotten in our own country, generally speaking, we've been ahead of the rest of the world. You want to see where this is really a problem, there are plenty of places in the world that you can find where most of the people are hungry. Most of the people are dressed in rags. Most of the people are, well, maybe not most of the people, but huge percentages of them are living in cardboard boxes or something that hardly keeps them sheltered. And very often that can be traced in a large way back to bad government, bad leadership. Not purely bad government, but leadership at all levels, right? Bad leaders in industry, bad leaders just in the community, as well as those who can make and enforce laws. So just to keep that in mind as we look at the list of things that we need. The detailed question is, what's the Lord emphasizing with the name with which he uses for himself in verse 1? So before we get into the list of support he's going to take away, he says, see now, the Lord Almighty is about to take from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support. So again, if you grew up in the Lutheran Church and if you're old enough to remember the 1941 hymnal, which was used in our church until 1993, so you don't have to be that old. But if you're old enough, well, of course, that's getting to be older than I think sometimes. How many years ago was that? 30-some?
Yeah.
Right? Over 30 years ago? All right, so if you're younger than, if you're older than your mid-30s, you maybe remember the 41 hymnal. The word there that's Almighty was sung in the translation we used of the Sanctus. Holy, holy, holy. Lord God of Sabaoth, not Sabbath, but there's an extra O in there. Sabaoth, Sabaoth is the Hebrew word, and that's the word that is translated here, Almighty. Anybody know what Sabaoth, Sabaoth, what that is actually?
Lord of hosts.
Hosts, and okay, and that's how the King James generally translated it. But even a word, when you think host, I think of somebody who is having me at their home, right? What's all, the Lord of, I don't know, people who have dinner guests over. What's the Lord of hosts?
That would be like Montgomery in Normandy.
Oh, okay, very good. So hosts in the sense
Hosts meaning millions have been about the
military, the
Yeah.
Lord of armies,
Right.
Right, and there are a few modern translations that have now picked that up. Now the gist of what he's trying to communicate with calling him the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies, is that he is the God who's all-powerful. And so it comes out sometimes here as here Almighty, because all the armies are beneath him. Sometimes it comes out as that he is the sovereign Lord, and that also emphasizes he rules over all things, but it's the power and strength of God. So that's the way that God chooses to identify himself as he is here to talk to the people about these judgments. It's not merely the Lord. You probably have heard this before, but when you see Lord in all capital letters, and if you've got your Bible in front of you, you notice, see now the Lord, the first time the Lord is mentioned there, it is not Lord in all capital letters, is it? That's Lord as in Lord or Master. And that also emphasizes rulership and strength. Now the next time it's with Lord Almighty, there you do see it in all caps, but Lord in all caps, that was the English convention for dealing with what's called the Tetragrammaton. It is the name that God had for himself on Mount Sinai when he revealed himself to Moses. In Hebrew, Yod-He, Vav-He, which sometimes gets transliterated either to Jehovah or Yahweh. But usually when that name stands alone, God is emphasizing his grace and mercy. The John 3:16 of the Old Testament is first given to Moses in the book of Exodus, chapter 34, I think, after the golden calf incident. And then it's repeated almost word for word in a number of places in the prophets, and I think David brings it up in the Psalms. But when Moses asks to see God's glory, and Moses says, well, I can't do that, it would kill you. But what I'll do is I'll proclaim my name to you. And by which he means you will be in my presence, you will catch some glimpse of who I am, and I will give you what my glory is really about, which is this message. And so he proclaims this, the Lord, the gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And this is the reputation God wants associated with Yahweh, Jehovah, Lord in all capital letters. Now, again, so we usually think law first, gospel second. In this case, because he wants to emphasize that gospel, the gospel comes first. It's only after he says that, he says, and yet he does not let the guilty go unpunished. But he visits the sins of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those that hate him. So it's not that he's a namby-pamby God. He is not the George Burns version of God in the movie Oh God, who is not a serious God, some cigar-smoking comedian. He is God, and you need to take him seriously. You do not trifle with this being. But the emphasis is on his grace. Except this chapter hardly has a few words of grace in it. And so he is emphasizing in this chapter his judgments. And as a result, the terms he uses indicate that as well. See now, the Lord Almighty, Tsevaot, hosts of armies beneath him. Question 2 there. After food and water, what's the next resource which the Lord will remove from Judah? And so we kind of talked to that in the general questions. Do you consider it a harsh judgment or a soft one? So when God removes the leaders in society, he lists them out. The hero and the warrior. Well, is this a harsh judgment, or is this a fairly easy to bear?
It's pretty hard.
It's like Gone with the Wind or Lord of the Flies.
In fact, I thought of Lord of the Flies here.
The early
in this
Middle
section.
Ages, every man went out and slaughtered whoever the heck he wanted, and there was nothing you could do about it.
Yeah, you had to. The worse than bad government is anarchy, right? Worse than bad government is anarchy, because then it's every man for himself, and that is not a good situation to be in. So let's take a look at the list here. Know what Judah loses. So they lose the hero and the warrior. What are they losing with that? Protection. Yeah. A soft army is not an army you need to have. We deplore violence. We deplore death. But your army has to be good at both, or worse things happen. You have to have the hero and the warrior. You have to have the fighting men who are going to make it tough on the enemy. You have to have it, or you're vulnerable. You're open, and then the weak in society have no one to protect them either. So, but God's taking away the hero and the warrior. An interesting thing, when you read about King David's reign, as you work through Samuel or as you work through Chronicles, so often it comes up who David's mighty men were, who were his. They weren't necessarily all the officers in the army. Sometimes they were just really good warriors. And they didn't need to be making the decisions and setting the strategy. They needed to be out there swinging swords at the front lines. Uriah the Hittite, whose life he takes with the whole Bathsheba incident, is one of these warriors of his who's just a good fighting man. He's just a good warrior, and you need to have people like that. But those people in David's administration are listed multiple times. It maybe reflects something that David was this man of blood who himself seemed to be always up for a good fight. He seemed to relish it maybe a little too much at times, but it kept God's people safe. And even for all of that, God still called him a man after his own heart. Because David wasn't just taking lives willy-nilly because it was a hobby. He wasn't just collecting scalps. David was protecting God's people. He was fighting for them.
And it seems like, a lot of times the person that was picked by God really wasn't considering themselves for warrior. Because I think about it like Gideon, when,
Yeah, he's reluctant, isn't he? He puts God through, 2 or 3 tests with the whole fleece thing, and I don't know if I want this job. Well, which is a little bit like what we read here later in Isaiah. It almost anticipates the time of Isaiah here. Nobody wanted the job. We'll get to that in just a moment. But yeah. If you have to do it, it's not bad that there be a little bit of reluctance, because you recognize it ought to be our strange and alien work too, when we have to be the instruments of God's judgment against someone. We would prefer to have our army be peacekeepers.
Even with Saul, he was the smallest tribe in Israel, and he got picked to be the king. He went and hid somewhere.
Hidden luggage, right? Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean,
And David himself, although he liked the war part of it, to be king, it's not as though he really pursued that. He let it come to him. He knew God anointed him, but you know all those times when he passed over the opportunity to simply seize control. Saul is God's anointed, and I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed. He will bring me to the throne at the proper time, and I'll just trust him on that. Right? And he maintained his integrity all that time. So, the warrior and the hero. The judge.
Justice.
What do you lose if God pulls?
The person who punishes the sinful or the ones who break laws.
Okay. So now society has a breakdown in justice and fairness when the judge is removed. And a fair and impartial judge is an important thing and a hard thing to find very often. So God's going to remove the judge, and justice and fairness will go. The prophet.
Spiritual leaders.
yeah.
Is it in Hosea? It's one of the other prophets. I write it down. I don't think I put a note about it. Where the prophet talks about the time coming when there's going to be a famine, not of food, but of the word of God. And for the believer, you understand that is a famine. Man does not live on bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Father. When the word is not available, that's a problem. And of course, for us at least, we've got print, right? Even if you had no one to preach it to you, you could still find it. In their time, there was much less of the Bible written down, and paper was a relatively rare thing. Books in the time of Jesus even could, the scrolls on which they'd be written, the value could be about commensurate with what it cost to own a house. So not everybody was carrying around their own copies of the Bible nearly. And if the prophet is gone, there is a problem. Right? How can the people be corrected? How can the society change if there is no prophet to speak for the Lord? The soothsayer. What? We might be tempted to say, good riddance. And under ordinary circumstances, Isaiah would probably have said good riddance. The thing is that for Israel, for those who didn't go to the temple or those who didn't go to the synagogue, this was their backup. And so while the soothsayer didn't actually provide any real value per se, He made the people who use him feel better. I don't remember if I used it in Bible class here or if it was a sermon recently, but so I got Sirius XM on my car radio, and apparently they've got a contract with some company out of California called California Psychics. The commercials, I would say they do, are entertaining because they don't take themselves so seriously sometimes. But they offer money-back guarantees on their psychic advice or readings, which seems like such an odd thing. And they talk about how, well, we don't just take anybody to be one of our psychics. We screen them carefully, and they have to pass some tests to prove that the predictions they're doling out have something to back them up and behind them. And I don't know what it costs to advertise on something like that, but I imagine they got to make some money to be able to advertise that way. I don't think our church can afford to advertise that way, which means they got to have some money rolling in, which means they have to have some people that think California Psychics is the guide to life. And people are calling in to talk to their people, and they're depending on that for making decisions. And you had the same thing in the Old Testament. So Isaiah talks about, in the previous chapter we saw, or was it chapter 1, the fact that the nation still on the surface looked pretty religious. They were keeping the regular festivals, they were offering the sacrifices they were supposed to, on the schedule they were supposed to be offered, but their hearts weren't in it. And at the same time, they had these secret idolatries running all over the place. They didn't really think much of the message that had come down to them through Moses and the prophets. So many of them were either spending other time at the temples and altars of Baal and Asherah, which was fun church. You go to church at the temple of Baal and Asherah, and they brought sex into it. So that's fun church, right? You didn't have this stodgy message about what's wrong with me and how I need to change. Just go there, and then I got this promise that my fields and flocks will be fertile because of what happened to church. So the people were leaning on that for their comforts. And then things like the soothsayer. So God's saying, even your false crutches, the things that make you feel better, even if they don't make you be better, I'm ripping those out too. You're not going to have, you're going to feel what it is to be completely solo. The elder.
Knowledge, experience.
Yeah, all right. Very good. Knowledge, experience. So not just because you need a population of geriatrics, but because the person who has had some life experience has the ability to actually give good advice, has the ability to lead in any of these other positions that we might have, or simply just that you have them as a part of the citizenry. We are a society that puts a high value on youth. And that's weird about us. When guys used to get calls to our churches in Zambia or Malawi, while here in the States, when I was in seminary, so they've had some debate about this, what shall we, hair fashion and facial hair fashion. The seminary would still like guys to be relatively clean-shaven and have a relatively short haircut, but more of the guys are saying, why should I have to do that? A lot of guys say are wearing longer hairstyles, and full beards has certainly been a thing for quite some time now. But in the past, what was the kind of the exception? If you went to one of those Central African churches of ours, those are cultures that treasure the elder, the experience. And if you had to send a young guy, that was problematic already. So he had better at least have some facial hair. And if he had some gray hair, that's better yet. Gray hair, well, what is it? Proverbs talks about how, gray hair is the crown of old age. And we tend to think, no, gray hair is the stuff I need to cover up with the hair dye so people can't guess what my age really is, because we value youth, because we all want to look like we're still in our mid-20s or 30s. We don't want to look like we're in our 50s, 60s, and 70s. It used to be, if you got to be your 50s and 60s and 70s, man, that's a sign that you made it. You know, you didn't die like most of the population at middle age in your 40s, but you'd arrived, right? There was something about you that was special. And then people respected that. And now God, for that would have been part of the culture of Israel too. If you made it to that age, that you were a person who just by virtue of your age had a lot of respect that went along with it. People would aspire to it. And now God says, all that experience, all that good advice, you know, the calming effect that people have seen, who've seen some things can have, we're ripping that cane, that crutch, that support out from underneath you as well. You're not going to have those people around there. They're going to be the first to die in the war. They're not going to make it, and you are not going to know what to do. The captain of 50, letter F. So a captain of 50. So obviously it's a person who's got enough leadership who is able to have other people under them. It's a person with a certain amount of management ability. The Romans identified many of their leading military officers in terms of how many people were they in charge of, you know, a legionnaire or a centurion, 100, at least 100 under him. And the people who could manage that many people were recognized as people who had good leadership skills in other ways. So the captain of 50, remember when Moses is having trouble with the children of Israel in the wilderness, which, okay, well, that's actually most of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but there's that time when his father-in-law Jethro comes to visit, and he says, well, it's bring your father-in-law to work day. So Jethro is there as Moses is having all the people come before him, and there's this line that goes to the end of the camp, and they all have an issue that he needs to decide as their judge. And one by one, Moses starts early in the morning, and he gets done late at night, and Jethro says, what are you doing? You can't go on this way. You're going to wear yourself out. This people is going to wear you out. You're going to wear out these people. So you've got to go. You got to pick elders. You got to find men who are capable of having good judgment, and you're going to divide the people into groups, and they'll take care of the smaller issues, and you can be the Supreme Court. The big problems can come to you, but you've got to have other people to help you bear this. And so there we hear that they had divided the camp into, I think, groups of thousands and hundreds and 50s and even down to tens, I believe, so that you had a system of people who had some recognized management skill and people who had some recognized wisdom to offer and the ability to do that. So another one of the props or supports God's pulling out from underneath him. The man of rank, okay, so it's a little bit obscure or vague in this case, but you think of the wise counselor. You know, every king in the past had his wise counselor. A lot of times, the wise counselor for the king was smarter than the king himself. But there is a difference between being able to stick a bunch of information in your head and being able to lead. Those are two different skill sets. Now, it's quite something when those happen to arrive at the same time in the same person. But that's exception, not rule. So those who have the ability to actually lead often will have people who are smarter than they are as their counselors. And the idea here of the man of rank would seem to be those kinds of people if the king would surround himself this way. Again, if you know Old Testament Bible history well, you know that when David is dealing with Absalom's rebellion, his son Absalom, he's got, so Ahithophel is one of them, and I don't remember the name of the other guy. But you have these two counselors, one who is a plant that he sends to Absalom. Well, Absalom has one, and then David sends this other man. And one of the men tells Absalom, your father's on the run, chase him down now and squash him. Get her done. And the other one says, hey, your father is a fighting man who's wise and wily, and you want to take your time to make sure you got all your forces gathered up and all your ducks in a row, because he's got this experience in battle. And the good advice in the situation was, David is on the run, go get him. But this guy listens to the other guy, and then the battle is lost because David has time to regroup. Or you have a similar thing, kind of opposite, with Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. So Rehoboam is going to take over as the new king after Solomon dies, and Rehoboam goes to the older men for counsel, and he asks the older men, what should I do? And they say, oh, your father had laid a heavy load on us. All these building projects were great, and we built this beautiful temple, and Jerusalem is secure, but you need to lighten up the taxes. And you need to lighten just the load on the people. And Rehoboam goes, oh, okay, that's an interesting idea. And then he goes to the young men. And what do the young men say? You show these people who's boss. My little finger will be like my father's waist. Which is the advice that appeals to Rehoboam's pride. And he takes that advice, and of course it's opposite. And because of that, he loses the 10 northern tribes. And the kingdom is split ever after. But so the man of rank would be the kind of people doling out that kind of advice to those in power. The counselor, similar, okay, advice. The craftsman. So this is a heavy on leadership so far, but the craftsman's a little different, isn't he? How's your experience been when you got projects at home you hire out?
Sometimes good, sometimes bad.
Sometimes good, sometimes not so good, right? You wonder if you can trust what they're telling you always. You got to replace this furnace, or you got to. Some of you know my tale of woe. In the front of my house, I wanted to put in a patio in a very shaded area. I couldn't grow anything, and we always liked to have a house in the past that had a front porch on it. And there was no roof over this area, but it would be kind of the next thing to a front porch, about 8 feet by 12 feet across the front, from the front steps over to the garage. And there's a person who works for my wife for Pizza Hut, does kind of handyman work, and he's a jack of all trades. If you look on his Facebook page, he's rehabbing houses, and he's got his fingers and things for this business and that business, and he puts in ovens for them and takes old stuff that they had and sells it online. He's all kinds of stuff so he's jack of all trades, master of none. Well, he certainly was not a master of this. So, but I put the thing out to bid for a few people, so nobody bid on it. And so he actually bid on it. It was reasonable price, I thought. So he's going to pour this concrete patio. Well, he's not going to do it himself. So I'm walking out of the house one day, and here's two guys in a compact pickup showing up. One of them's wearing Bermuda shorts and flip-flops. What do you? Can I help you? Well, we're here to put in your patio. Really? So I give Luis a call, and I said, these guys just showed up in my driveway in a pickup truck, and one of them's wearing Bermuda shorts and flip-flops. It's not like they're in steel-toed boots and construction wear. Oh, John, these guys are professionals. You don't have to worry about these guys. Famous last words. When I got home that evening, that patio looked like a sculpture of waves on the sea. It was the last wave slopping up against the house itself. And the finish was horrible. And I finally had to call Luis and say, I think you need to come over and look at this. It didn't take him long at all to say, it's all got to come out. And then it was, a year before he finally got someone over there with a jackhammer to jackhammer it out. And then it was another 6 months before he and one of his workers, instead of bringing the big concrete cement mixer truck up, they just buy one of these ones on a trailer and mix it there and pour it. And it's not perfect, but I can live with what he's got there now.
But who was the guys that put it in? Was the owners of this company that all their
Well,
people
well,
quit?
so this man had the company, and he lost his crew.
It was a
And he
COVID.
thought, he used to do concrete work, and he thought,
I could do it.
yeah, I remember how this goes. Yeah,
You were
he was 30 years older and it had gotten past him, right? But we had hail damage, and they messed up. I've got a window that in my bedroom now that needs to be, it's the replacement window that needs to be replaced again. It won't open. Anyway, the craftsman means more to society than people realize until you run into the issue. If society is going to function properly. The clever enchanter, it's a little bit like the soothsayer, that the people kind of depended on this false sense of magic in order to try to get along, they thought. And with all these props God is ripping out, he's saying, you're going to really experience what it is to be alone, what it is to try to get by all by yourself, and you're going to see, you're going to feel my heavy hand against you. But all of these things were working against society as a whole, and all of them meant for the correction and discipline of Judah and Jerusalem. All right. We'll pick it up at question 4 next time in Isaiah chapter 3.